The interests here are similar to the interests in Central Asia. They flow from the border. They flow from problems of security and stability. China with Pakistan, though, of course, has had a secondary interest, which touches its strategic, I don't want to say competition, but its largest strategic relationship with India. And so China and Pakistan have had complementary objectives that a close relationship has allowed them to pursue vis-a-vis India. Putting Afghanistan aside for a second, I think Pakistan is the much more interesting and important place to watch China's relationships in this region for the United States, because China is so well established there politically, strategically, its military relationships, economically and otherwise. And I guess the questions that occurred to me are these. First, we need to remember that the US and China actually have a pretty good history of cooperation, especially in the last decade, in both Afghanistan and Pakistan. On Afghanistan, we remember there was the 6+2. China was a part of the 6+2. After 9/11, China's support for resolutions 1368 and 1373, participation in the Tokyo Donors Conference, the London Donors Conference, the more recent Hague Donors Conference. There's a history there. Likewise with Pakistan, the United States and China have talked about Pakistan for a long time. Remember Kissinger's secret visit to China. He made it, remember, he snuck out through Islamabad. So long-standing relationship. But remember that China is Pakistan's closest security partner alongside the United States. These are the two closest external security partners for Pakistan. So at a time when the administration is really focused not just on Afghanistan, but the larger situation in this region, three questions really occur to me. The first is, does China share American threat assessments in Pakistan, particularly as American threat assessments have shifted over the last several years from Pakistan's external orientation vis-a-vis, say, the Soviet threat, to the strength and stability of domestic and institutional development in Pakistan? Because my sense in talking to Chinese is they really don't share the sense of threat that you hear in the United States. And partly that's a function of close relationships with the Pakistani military. Partly it's just a sense I have that they're much more relaxed about the situation in Pakistan. Second, there's a history of the United States and China talking about developments in Pakistan, whether it's infiltration across the line of control, whether it's Indo-Pak competition and military balance, and otherwise. But certainly my experience in government was that China frequently water-carried American messages rather than sending complementary Chinese messages. And so one question I have is, as the administration tries to pursue a discussion with China about AFPAC, but especially about Pakistan, does China see its own objectives in that country in parallel to the way, say, Ambassador Holbrooke defines American objectives? And to the extent that we coordinate, is China simply going to Islamabad and saying, here's what the Americans are thinking, here's what the Americans are concerned with, as opposed to this is what we're concerned with? That's going to be a question going forward, and it's been an open question, at least for me in the past. And the third question is, we need to remember the United States has developed a very special strategic relationship with India over the last few years, and we can talk about this if you'd like as well. And so anytime you talk about American-Chinese condominiums in Pakistan, or US-Pakistan-Chinese understandings, we need to remember how and in the ways that it touches India's equities and our larger strategic relationship with India. So to conclude, just moving to India. I think on this we need to, you've read some of the press lately, we need to remember, I think, that for India, China in many ways is a first-tier security priority. But for China, India is a second, if not third-tier security priority, as I think of China's hierarchy of security priorities. And that's important because it explains, I think, some of the differential that you see in terms of Indian press talking so much about China vis-a-vis Chinese press talking a little bit less about India. The economic relationship is going like gangbusters. I think if you throw services in, the United States is still India's #1 trading partner. But in goods, China's now #1. And so there's a huge explosion in the economic relationship, but an enormous amount of mutual, well, strategic mistrust on both sides. And the manifestations of that on the Indian side are a sense that China essentially has decided that to the extent the next century is an Asian century, it ain't going to be big enough for more than one. And so there is a sense in India that China seeks to tamp down India's aspirations. And we can talk about whether that's true or not, but that is a very tangible perception on the Indian side. And it manifests itself first in the way in which China is increasingly moving to the center of India's defense planning, replacing Pakistan. in these debates in India about the reliability of India's strategic deterrent, whether India needs to test again, what a CTBT would mean for the reliability of India's deterrent. On the Chinese side, the way it manifests itself really is concerned with the US-India relationship, because to put this very, very crudely, and I'm going to put this pretty crudely, since 1962, I think Chinese strategists have basically decided that they can deal with India on their own terms. But when you introduce the United States into that equation, it introduces all kinds of uncertainties into Chinese planning. And so the US-India relationship has introduced a lot of uncertainties. So just to conclude, I think we're in for a period of India-China tension. There are things that are ratcheting up on the border a little bit, but I think broadly tamped down within limits that are set by the political leaderships on both sides. The logic of a settlement on the border is pretty clear, but the political mathematics aren't in place, especially in India, but not in China either. But on both sides, I think the political leaderships want to keep this within certain limits. So I'll stop there.
Great, Evan. Thank you very much. If you came into this conference thinking that the rise of China was a one-dimensional phenomenon, certainly this panel should dissuade you of that. I know we have a much more sophisticated audience than that, so I think rather than me speaking too much up here, I would like to open the floor when I can. But let me just, a couple of broad comments from each of our speakers. It seems to me I was particularly impressed by China's capacity to engage globally, be it functionally or geographically, will be ultimately determined by its own domestic capacities. And I think each of our speakers highlighted some of the fundamental internal challenges